We were in a sort of heaven mode where all this manna was falling down for us to write about all these big star DJs getting fired. There was a goldmine of stories here. And we're nevertheless sitting there thinking, oh my God, you know, it's like every week there's another DJ going. You start thinking, well, the guy that's making this decision of getting rid of these people is killing Radio 1. And that was, without doubt, across the board in Fleet Street, was the perception that Matthew Bannister was doing, that he was killing Radio 1.
As the dust settled and a new era dawned, one of the old guard was promised a central role in Matthew's schedule. Although no teenager, Steve Wright was regarded as a rare talent who would appeal to younger listeners.
Steve Wright had the biggest audience of any show on the network, and it's received wisdom, and it's right that you should put your biggest star on at breakfast time. Breakfast time is the time when the biggest audiences come to radio. It's the most important show. It has a disproportionate effect on the performance of the whole station. It's the shop window for the whole station.
Matthew's plan was to use Steve Wright to attract millions of listeners in the mornings and then keep them hooked to the station with new talent. Joe Wiley, Lisa Ianson, Tim Westwood, and Matthew's big hope, Danny Baker.
My view is that Danny's one of the most creative radio broadcasters that exists in this country.
Baker was best known across the country for a set of commercials in which he knocked on people's doors armed with a packet of soap powder. But he had also been presenting a football chat show on Radio 5.
I got a call for the agent. What about Radio 1? What about Radio 1? Well, you can get, you know, the same amount of money you're getting, more than actually you get for doing a daily show, just for doing 2 hours on Saturdays and Sundays. What, oh? Well, show me the door, so I know if I went to Radio 1.
On the 30th of October 1993, Danny Baker went on air for the first time. 15 million listeners expecting a DLT-hosted snooker quiz were shocked to find a loudmouth Cockney asking people to phone in with stories about how they got babies' rattles stuck to their heads. But more shocked than anyone were DLT himself, listening to the show from his Warwickshire ranch, and anarchic funster Adrian Just, whose programme was scheduled to follow the new Radio 1 megastar.
I remember Danny Baker's first show. I'd never been so depressed in my life. I was working in the studio, trying to get the show ready. I remember DLT phoning up about 10:30. I had a dreadful morning, I remember it well. It didn't get any better as the day went on. And he phoned up and he sounded heartbroken. He said, "Are you listening to this crap?" I said, "Dave," I said, "don't depress me." I said, "I've got to go in and try and do a fun show, try and pull it off the floor at 1 o'clock. And I did. I mean, how we did any comedy shows, I don't know, but we did, and we did some of the best shows ever. Touch wood, I say it myself.
Danny Baker broadcasting at 100 miles an hour, standing up with a Cockney accent and saying weird things and talking about P.G. Wodehouse and things like that. This is not simple broadcasting. But I thought that what the BBC should do is be able to support people who were inventive and surreal and different.
It was just a disaster. From the first minute, you knew it wasn't part of Radio 1 and not what Radio 1 was about. And all the years we'd worked, it was just destroyed it in 5 minutes.
Within weeks, Baker's audience was down to 7 million. But this was fine by the Daz man.
I'd come from an audience of 1.5 million to an audience of 7 or 8, even though that was down on the 15 that DLT had. I'd never been such a hit. I've got 7 million people.
But it wasn't just Danny Baker. Many of Matthew's signings were struggling to attract the new, younger audience he wanted. And the old listeners were abandoning Radio 1, choosing instead to follow DLT and Simon Bates to commercial stations.
Matthew had had this phenomenal rise through the BBC. He was experiencing that fantastic golden boy thing, and it was beginning to go wrong. Now, that's a great test of your character.
I don't think it would be too incorrect to say that I think various stories are going out that, you know, Matthew Bannister still got a job at the BBC. They must be mad.
I think it was amazing how much support the BBC gave me, and in fact, I think that only the BBC could have done this, because in a commercial organisation, I'm sure I'd have been fired.
In the spring of 1995, a beleaguered Matthew went to a country retreat to plan the next big strategic step for his station. Here, he decided that Radio 1 needed to appoint someone with his finger right on the pulse of what young people were listening to.
We certainly took the view that what we should do is make a search to see exhaustively who the best people out there were.
And to make sure he got the very best, headhunters were employed to trawl the world for the man who would make Radio 1 cool again.
I was sitting in my office and the phone rang. This woman said, "I'm from an executive search company," she said. She said, "Well, it's a big job at the BBC." No, you've got the wrong man, because that would be working with my friend Matthew. And if he wanted me, he'd just ring me up.
But it was his friend Matthew, and he did want Trevor. Radio 1 now braced itself for a new wave of sackings. Where Matthew had specialised in DJs, Trevor, nicknamed in the press Dan the Hatchet Man, concentrated on getting rid of behind-the-scenes stuff. And he was also on the lookout for any old-school DJs who'd slipped through Matthew's fingers. Like Bruno Brooks.
A lot of fun, that. In fact, you can buy that in the shops. Actually, it's Status Quo.
We got to this point where you were thinking, well, why is Bruno on? You know, he seems to have a charmed life, because if the view was we must get rid of the dinosaurs, you know, we've got this behemoth striding the airwaves of dawn. And, you know, I couldn't see much point in keeping him on there. But the audience was really good. He had a big audience of truckers.
Matthew and Trevor agreed that Bruno's days were numbered. But the fatal swing of Trevor's hatchet was to reach much further than the dingy corridors of Egton House. If he was to make Radio 1 feel young again, he knew he had to take on the biggest dinosaurs of them all, the aging rock stars. And where better to start than with Status Quo?
Well, you know how Status Quo records go, don't you? Because they're all the same, pretty much, aren't they? Very nice. I love Status Quo. But if you could point to any either data or instinct that said that people aged 17 were buying Status Quo records, then play the record.
With no evidence of this, Trevor decided that Radio 1 would not play Status Quo records anymore. But where the DJs had run squealing from the carnage of Egton, the monsters of rock sharpened their talons and prepared for a fight.
And they held a press conference where they said that they were going to sue the BBC. They wanted a judicial review of BBC Radio 1's music policy because it wasn't playing their records.
But in a twist of fate, the wrath of Quo was to prove a turning point for Radio 1.
It was fantastic publicity for us. Suddenly, here was something that a good proportion of the target audience could sign up to. They could go, hey, great, it's a station that doesn't play Status Quo.
Now, with Trevor imposing a new music policy that excluded all records recorded before 1990 and anything ever recorded by the Quo, audience figures stopped falling.